Hello and welcome back to week 5 of American Government. This is part 2 of what we're going to look at this week, and we're going to cover chapter 13, which is over the federal bureaucracy. So far in our studies, we've already looked at the 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, kind of gotten an idea of what they do, but we haven't really covered a very important aspect of our modern American government today that does a lot of the actual work of government. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the administrative agencies of the federal government and the work that they do. Technically, most of these agencies belong to the executive branch. However, they have really increased in size and importance in modern times, so much so that many people refer to them as the 4th branch of government because they do wield so much power. And as we look at what they actually do on a day-to-day basis, they actually perform some of the functions of all of the other 3 branches. And so really quite interesting, the kind of work that they do. So we're going to examine the role that they play and how they came to be as big and powerful as they are today. Remember, we talked about this some time back, but at the beginning of the country, the federal government was very small, both in terms of the number of people who worked for it and also what it was asked to do. It just wasn't really asked to do all that much. It didn't have a huge part in most people's daily life. The Constitution delegated certain powers to the federal government that the states supposedly couldn't handle, such as interstate commerce and national defense, but by and large, most things were left in the hands of the states. And so the role of the federal government was actually fairly limited. Even then, of course, we had folks who were full-time government employees. They weren't elected into office, they were just hired to do a job, and they were charged with implementing government policy. And somebody had to be there doing the day-to-day work, collecting the tax revenue, issuing permits, writing letters to other departments and other people, sweeping the floors, you name it. Somebody had to be there doing all of that stuff. And the various departments of the executive branch, such as the Department of State, all had employees that were carrying out most of the work of government. And of course, we'd have the elected politicians who would be in charge, but we also had a lot of folks that just showed up every day and punched the clock and did their work for the government and kept things running. However, at the beginning, probably the total number of federal employees numbered just a few thousand at most. So again, the federal government started out fairly small. As we know, though, the role of the federal government has changed over time. We saw that during the New Deal in the 1930s, the power of the federal government and its reach into our everyday lives just really exploded. And federal government just kept doing more and more things and kept getting involved in more and more aspects of American life. And so as that happened, the government had to grow with it. And we saw during the New Deal, a lot of new social welfare programs were created, such as Social Security. And that required new people to be hired in new agencies, in this case the Social Security Administration, or SSA, to be created to deal with those new programs and administer them. And during this period of history, new agencies were springing up constantly. We had the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. In fact, there was a joke that said something about alphabet soup during those days, because we had all of these acronyms floating around from these brand new government agencies that were springing up all the time. And so over time we saw that's been the trend. The federal government has taken to regulating more and more businesses and activities. For example, in the 1970s, the federal government decided to get involved in regulating environmental pollution. That really became a concern in the late 60s and 1970s. And so the federal government invented a new agency, the EPA, to create regulations to try to protect the environment, to enforce those regulations, and to punish people who violated them. And so it started this new federal agency to do that. And it seems that almost every time the federal government has instituted some new spending program or regulatory scheme of some kind, it likes to create some new agency to carry out that initiative. And so the federal government has grown a huge amount over the years as it has taken on more and more responsibilities. Currently, this number changes all the time. I think there's about around 3 million federal employees now. So it's a huge employer. Some agencies are very small. The Department of Defense has 2 of those 3 million employees, both the members of the military and civilians who work for the Department of Defense. And so the federal government has just become this gargantuan thing that has its tentacles in all kinds of aspects of American life. And so it has really grown up a lot, and the organization of government to carry out all these government programs and regulations and things has grown with it. Well, when we look at all these government agencies that have been created, the EPA, the Social Security Administration, whatever it is, we could fairly wonder where in the world is the constitutional authority for that. I don't read anything about the EPA in the Constitution. So since the Constitution really doesn't say anything about government agencies, why do we have them? Where do we get the authority for that? Well, the power and authority of the federal bureaucracy, these agencies, is rooted in the ability of the legislative and executive branches to delegate their powers. In other words, they just let this other entity, this agency, borrow their powers temporarily. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to make laws. Article 2 gives the President the power to carry out his executive powers required to enforce the laws. And so what happens when these various federal agencies are created, the laws which set them up that were passed by Congress and signed by the President specified that the legislative and executive branches were letting these agencies borrow some of their power. And so Congress and the President just agree to let these agencies do some of the work of creating and enforcing the laws, just let them kind of borrow that power for a while. And so the statutes that create these agencies specify this. For instance, the EPA was created by a statute that gives that agency the power to regulate pollution and enforce those rules. And so Congress gave the EPA, temporarily at least, some power to create things that look a lot like statutes to regulate the environmental quality and pollution and stuff like that. And they also have the power to enforce those laws, to send inspectors out and make sure people are obeying the rules. And so those were powers that previously belonged to Congress and the President, but Congress and the President let the EPA borrow that power to go protect the environment. And so that's how that works. It's through delegation of the power by Congress and the President to these agencies. And so that's where they get their legitimacy under the Constitution. The federal agencies collectively together are often called the federal bureaucracy. And that term is thrown around a lot, but I think we need to define it to really understand what we're talking about. The term bureaucracy doesn't apply just to government entities. It exists almost everywhere, really. We can define it as having three characteristics. First of all, it's just an organization of people. They have a hierarchical management structure, and they have specific responsibilities. And so that's a pretty broad definition. And if you think about it, we have examples of bureaucracy all around us. For example, Walmart could be considered a bureaucracy. And if you look at the structure of Walmart, they have individual stores, and that's an organization of people. They're running the store. They have a hierarchical management structure. They have a store manager and assistant managers and so on. And above the store manager, there's a district manager and a regional manager and a vice president and a president. And so there's a power structure there, and that's what that hierarchical management structure means. They're just different levels of power and responsibility. And they have specific responsibilities. You know, Walmart is all about selling stuff, and so the different people within that organization have their own responsibilities, and you know they have an overall mission as well. Crowder College's administration can be defined as a bureaucracy. It's made up of people. They have a hierarchical management structure. There's a president, vice presidents, different department heads and so forth. And they also have specific responsibilities that they're supposed to do. Get you an education, but as an overall mission, each individual within that structure, has responsibilities. And so bureaucracy is a very broad thing, but when a lot of people talk about it, they're talking about the government, kind of in generic terms. But that term can really apply to any kind of organization that's set up this way. And so we have bureaucracy all around us. But when we talk about the federal bureaucracy, we're normally talking about all these agencies that were created to do the kind of grunt work of the government. So when we talk about what these agencies do, usually what happens is the federal government, through Congress and the President, are kind of big picture people. They will have some kind of overall general policy goal that they want to accomplish, and then they will let the agencies turn that into reality. So let's say, for example, back in the 30s here, Congress wanted to provide money to old folks who are retired. And so it passed the Social Security Act. Well, yay, we passed the Social Security Act. This is wonderful. We'll get money in the pockets of old people. Okay. Well, do you think that the members of Congress, when they pass this act, plan to sit around deciding, who deserved a check and who didn't, figuring out how much the check should be written for, and then begin writing the checks and addressing the envelopes and, licking the stamps and all of that? Members of Congress have better things to do, so they're not going to be doing that. And so what they did is they created the Social Security Administration, which was a bureaucracy charged with implementing Congress's big picture policy goal. Our big picture is we're going to provide a social safety net to the elderly. We're going to make sure they have enough money to get food and clothing and shelter and that sort of stuff. But Congress doesn't have time to implement that policy. And so they ended up creating an agency to do that, to actually write the checks and lick the envelopes and all of that stuff, to actually get the money into the hands of the people who need it. And so the Social Security Administration was, kind of the little picture people. The big picture was Congress's idea. This is what we want to do. We want to make American society a better place. How do we do that? Well, we'll create an agency that carries out our goals and implements those, turns them into reality. And so that's how it normally works. Congress and the president will decide, this is what our priorities are. This is what we want to do. And then the actual grunt work of making that a reality falls to these agencies. And so the actual success of federal programs often depends on how well the various federal agencies actually carry them out. So Congress and the president can have wonderful ideas, but if the federal bureaucracy stumbles and doesn't do a good job of implementing those ideas, it's not going to work. And so sometimes we'll see examples of government waste and mismanagement and that sort of thing. And usually what's going on is one of these agencies fell asleep at the switch and failed to carry out Congress's goal in an efficient way. So the success of these programs really depends on how well these agencies are able to function. So what powers do these agencies actually have? Well, we said Congress and the president delegate some of their powers to these agencies. What powers they actually end up with depends on their function. Some agencies need more powers than others to fulfill their roles, and so there's a wide variety of powers that are given out depending on what the agency is charged with doing. And that's determined in the statute that creates the agency. Congress will write that in when they're creating the Social Security Administration or the EPA. They will determine how much power they're going to have. But interestingly enough, many agencies have powers that mimic all three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. So they will have the power to do all kinds of things that looked a lot like what all three branches of government are actually doing. So we'll take a look at how they manage to do that. First, agencies often have legislative type powers, and that's embodied in their rulemaking authority. Agencies can enact rules, and they look a lot like statutes passed by Congress and signed by the president, but they're not. They're just created by the agency. But they're rules that we have to live by. They have the force of law. And if one of these rules has been enacted following the legal procedure that is laid out for them, everyone has to obey those agencies' rules unless they want to pay a fine or be thrown in jail. And so they really are important. You can't ignore them just because they're a rule and not a statute. If one of these agencies has followed the procedure and enacted one of these, it has the force of law. Congress has established a specific procedure for rulemaking. The first step in that, an agency will come up with a proposed rule it thinks is necessary to carry out its mission, and it will publish its draft rule in an official government publication called the Federal Register. And so that's kind of like the public notice. That's giving everyone a chance to see, hey, everyone, we're thinking about publishing or making this new rule. It's published here so you can see it before it actually becomes law. And so you can let us know what you think about it. And so after the publication, interested parties, sometimes private companies, maybe just members of the public, they have a chance to comment on these rules and tell the agency what they think is good about it or bad about it. And that's what we call the comment period. That's a set length of time after it's published in the Federal Register that people have a chance to make suggestions, gripe, or whatever they want to do about this proposed rule. And so the agency has to keep track of all this and see what the public actually thinks and consider those suggestions and gripes and everything before the rule actually becomes law. After the comment period is over, the agency is going to hold hearings. It may question witnesses, consider the comments that it received. It'll look a lot like a congressional hearing in front of a committee in Congress. And then the agency may decide to alter the proposed rule based on the suggestions it gets, or it may even decide it's a bad idea and give it up. So the comment period can be very persuasive depending on what the reaction is to this proposed rule. If the agency does move forward, it will publish the rule in final form in the Federal Register again, and after a certain length of time, the rule will become law. And so when that happens, it has the force of law, and you must obey it. And so this is an example of Congress delegating part of its lawmaking authorities to agencies. And so these rules have the same force of law, basically, as a statute passed by Congress, because Congress let the agency borrow some of their power to make laws. And so we have to obey those rules if they follow this procedure appropriately. Let's take a look at an example here where this would happen. For example, Congress passed the Clean Air Act decades ago to regulate air pollution. And then they gave the EPA the power to make rules on air pollution. So the Clean Air Act itself, that's the big picture. We don't want smog. We don't want nasty stuff in the air that we breathe. But of course, Congress doesn't have the time or the expertise, frankly, to sit around debating what chemicals cause smog, how many parts per million of benzene is too much, that sort of stuff. And so they leave all that to the EPA. And the EPA employs scientists, has time to figure all this stuff out, how much of each chemical is too much, what makes smog and what doesn't, that sort of thing. And so they'll sit around and figure out, okay, these are the rules that we need. And they'll draft proposed rules, they'll hold hearings, publish them in the Federal Register, all that stuff. And then they'll enact rules that everyone has to live by to prevent smog from happening. And so we see there Congress set the broad policy goal if we want clean air, and then said, okay, EPA, you go figure out how to make that happen. And so the EPA took that borrowed power, made some rules to prevent air pollution and make that happen. And so that's what we see happening. Congress really just does work on the big picture stuff a lot of the time, and then delegates the power to actually turn those goals into reality to these different federal agencies. An agency's rulemaking authority is limited to its area of expertise, and so that's set up in the statute that creates the agency. For instance, the EPA can only make rules dealing with pollution. The EPA can't go make a rule that regulates a prescription drug or something that people take to get rid of their headaches or something. It has nothing to do with their mission. They're supposed to be worrying about the environment, so they can't go beyond the boundaries of their authority there. It is fairly limited. And for instance, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, can only make rules dealing with broadcast media. They can't go try to regulate air pollution because that's not their job. That's the EPA's job. And so they do have to stay in their lane there and not get outside of their area of expertise. Also, it's important to know that these agency rules do have the force of law while they're in place, but at any time they can be overridden by an act of Congress. So if Congress passes a law that contradicts an agency rule, that agency rule is overridden because, remember, Congress gave the agency the power to make the rules in the first place, and so it can take that power away whenever it chooses to do so. So if Congress sees the EPA make some rule and Congress doesn't like the rule, all Congress has to do is go pass a statute that overturns that rule, and it's gone. So at any time, Congress can step in, be the 800-pound gorilla, and just say, sorry, agency, we don't like that rule, and undo it. And so the agencies do have a lot of power, but only it's still subject to Congress, and Congress can come back and undo whatever the agency did that Congress doesn't like. Also, if an agency rule is passed that turns out conflicts with an existing law passed by Congress, the rule is going to be invalid. And so let's say that the EPA passes some rule on air pollution, and somebody challenges that in court and says, hey, look, Congress passed a statute 5 years ago that contradicts this rule. Well, then the court will throw out that rule that the EPA passed because whatever Congress does trumps what the agency does. And so Congress is the 800-pound gorilla here, and the agency, can't contradict Congress. And so whatever Congress says is what we have to live with. The agency can just make rules within the guidelines given by Congress. So whatever Congress does is going to trump what the agency does. So we've seen how the agencies have legislative powers. They also have executive powers because they need some way to enforce their own rules or no one would pay attention to them. The EPA could be passing air pollution standards all day long, but if it didn't have some power to enforce those rules, then no one would pay attention to them. So Congress gives many agencies executive authority to go enforce the rules that they implement. And so, for an example, suppose the EPA uses its rulemaking power to prohibit the dumping of used motor oil into rivers and streams. That would be bad. It'd kill the fish. So EPA has investigators and enforcement officers on staff who can go out, investigate reports of people dumping oil into rivers, and if it catches them, it can charge them with a rule violation and fine them. And so it can, do these investigations and, have agency employees going around writing people up, for these offenses. And so that's how it enforces the rules. And many agencies have similar powers like this to enforce their own rules and have the power to levy fines and that sort of thing to convince people that they need to follow these rules. And so that's an example of the executive power being delegated to these agencies as well. Some agencies also have a type of judicial power. They get the chance to hear and decide cases that involve their own rules. And to do that, they will employ people that look a lot like just normal judges, but they're called administrative law judges, or ALJs. And these are actually technically agency employees. However, they're supposed to be impartial. And there are mechanisms in place to help ensure that they are. But these folks work as judges, and so if somebody is charged with a rule violation, for instance, and wants to dispute it, a lot of times they'll end up first in front of an ALJ, and they'll hear the case first before they ever have hope of getting to a real court. In the judicial branch, they'll have to go through the agency's own little mini judicial system first. For an example, say that you're charged with violating some kind of agency rule. The agency issues you a citation and a fine. Well, if you want to fight the charge, your first impulse might be, well, I'm going to take them to court. Well, the way that the law is set up, before you do that, you may very well be forced to go before an ALJ in the agency and have a proceeding within that agency before you get to a real court. And after the ALJ gets a chance to hear the case, then if you're dissatisfied with what the agency did, you'll be allowed to appeal your case into like a federal district court, just a regular court. An Article 3 court is what we say, just a regular federal court. And so we'll make you go through this mini judicial system within the agency first. And so that actually is kind of helpful because it keeps a lot of these rule cases out of the federal courts, and we don't want them to get clogged up with this stuff. And these ALJs actually become experts on the area of law that they're dealing with in their particular agency. So this can actually be pretty helpful. Here's another practical example of this judicial power of agencies. At the state level, moving away from the federal government for just a moment, state agencies in every state administer a workers' compensation system. And that is designed to give benefits, financial compensation to workers who are injured on the job. So like if you're on a construction site and, a piece of wood falls on you and, sends you to the hospital, there's a mechanism for dealing with that through the workers' compensation system to get you some money for dealing with your injury because you're not able to work. And so when we have an injured worker file a claim, a lot of times, unfortunately, the employer will dispute the extent of the injuries. And so they'll end up having an argument about how much money is actually owed. And so what we end up with looks a lot like a court case with the injured worker versus the employer. However, these cases have to be heard by an ALJ before we actually end up in a real court. And so the workers' compensation system provides administrative law judges just to hear workers' comp cases. And so that's all they do all day is deal with these cases under the workers' compensation system. And once they're actually done with the case and it's been decided, for the employer or the employee one way or the other, only then, if one of the parties is still unhappy, they'll have the chance to appeal it to a regular state court. So then they could end up before an actual bona fide judge, not just an administrative law judge, but a real judge, quote unquote. And then they can, argue before that court, that the ALJ did something wrong. But a lot of times the hearing that you have before the ALJ will look a lot like a trial in a regular courtroom. Both sides will have lawyers, there'll be evidence, there'll be witnesses testifying, and that sort of thing. And when the ALJ makes a final ruling, it's going to have the force of law. And unless somebody appeals it, that's going to be how the case is decided. But as I said, most agency decisions are appealable into the regular courts in the judicial branch. And so if one of the parties is unhappy, they can appeal it again and get into a regular court. But these agencies have the power to hear these cases first. And so a lot of people end up with cases before an ALJ before they can ever get it into a real court, even if they want to. Now we're going to talk about the different types of agencies that we have, and there are several different varieties of them. The first is what we call departments, and these are within the executive branch, and they are pretty large organizations usually within the executive branch. Currently, there are 15 different departments. We have the Department of State, for instance, the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Homeland Security, and there are others as well. These are pretty important types of agencies, and the heads of these agencies will answer directly to the president, and so he is their supervisor, their boss, and they are considered a member of the cabinet, and so potentially at least one of the president's most trusted advisors, because they're in charge of a large chunk of the federal government. They are normally given some kind of broad policy area to manage, and so the Department of Defense is completely in charge of managing the defense of the country. That's a pretty huge responsibility. Department of Agriculture manages all different kinds of agriculture, be it fishing for fish or cutting down trees to make paper or planting soybeans or whatever it is, across the country. They're in charge of agriculture, and that's a pretty big area too. And so they're all given some kind of broad policy area. And most of these departments have large numbers of employees and broad responsibilities. So, we're talking, many thousands of employees most of the time in this kind of agency. And they're given a very broad area of responsibility. Then we have what we call independent agencies. And they're independent in the sense that they're outside of these 15 different departments. And they normally just deal with one specific type of policy issue. The jobs that they do vary widely. It's all kinds of examples we could have, but we already talked a lot about the EPA, which is solely charged with protecting the environment. That's the only job that they have. The Smithsonian Institution, for example, runs a museum. That's all they do. The National Science Foundation hands out grant money to scientists who are trying to do research and make advances in science. And so many different types of jobs that they can do, but for the most part, they just deal with this one specific policy area. Just because they're not one of the big old departments doesn't mean they're not important, though. A lot of these agencies that are independent, like the EPA, for example, actually have a pretty good deal of power in terms of rulemaking and enforcement. So they, carry a lot of weight, even though they're not one of the main 15 departments. They're independent in the sense that they are not part of some larger agency, so they just stand on their own, and that's really all that means. The heads of these agencies do answer directly to the president, although they're not normally considered members of the cabinet because these agencies may be in charge of a narrow area and just seen as less important than the larger departments. So the heads of these agencies aren't normally seen as members of the cabinet like the department heads would be. However, the president does have the option of temporarily elevating the heads of these agencies to cabinet level status. That only lasts for the president's term of office, though. But a lot of recent presidents have elevated the heads of the EPA and CIA to cabinet level, which signifies the importance that the administration gives those areas. It's just kind of a, look everyone, I'm really concerned about national security and the environment. Look at me, I've elevated these department heads of the CIA and the EPA to cabinet level status. It just really proves to everyone that you really place priority on the jobs that these agencies are doing. And so presidents can choose to do that. But again, it just lasts for their period of time in office. Another type of agency we have is independent regulatory commissions. And these are like independent agencies in that they deal with fairly narrow issues most of the time. However, unlike the independent agencies, which are just independent in the sense that they're not part of some bigger agency, these have a lot of independence, actually. And they do not answer directly to the president or to Congress. They're kind of out there on their own. And they are composed normally of a board that is made up of people from both political parties. In fact, they will specify, there has to be, 6 members of the board, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, just to make sure everything is fair. And they will serve, the members of these boards will serve set terms in office, and then, somebody new will be appointed when their term is up. So for an example, imagine we have one of these commissions. It would consist of 6 people. The law would require that there be 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans making up this board. And then each of these people would serve, let's say, a term of 4 years. So the president could appoint people to this commission when there's a vacancy. The Senate would confirm that nomination. But once they're confirmed, the president couldn't fire any of these folks once they were on the commission. Kind of like a judge on the Supreme Court, a justice almost. And having this arrangement makes sure that these commissions are free from political interference. And so they can concentrate on regulating their areas of policy fairly without a lot of pressure from congressmen and the president or whoever wants to steer them a particular direction. And so they can be there fairly unbiased, from insulated from all this political pressure and just do what's best for the country, is the idea there. So we truly want them to be independent and not be forced to lean one way or the other depending on which way the political winds are blowing at that point in time. Some examples of independent regulatory commissions would include the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is in charge of regulating broadcast media, and the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates some types of interstate commerce, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which licenses nuclear power plants and that sort of thing. All these are, we don't want them to be influenced too much by political pressure, and so they were created as independent regulatory commissions. And some of these, like the FCC, have a good deal of rulemaking and enforcement power. For example, goodness, it's been over 10 years ago now, but you may remember, or at least have heard about it, in a Super Bowl halftime show some years ago, and Janet Jackson exposed part of her body she should not have. And the FCC responded by fining TV stations for violating its rules. They were showing indecent content that scarred some kiddos for life, probably. So they were able to, they had made these rules. You can't show your private parts on TV, and this rule was violated. So they went out, held hearings and whatever, and enforce their rules by fining the broadcasters who were showing this material. And so some of these independent regulatory commissions can have a good deal of power to carry out their responsibilities, whatever those happen to be. Yet another type of agency is what we call a government corporation. And these agencies are kind of interesting because they actually look and act like a business, just a regular business, except they are owned by the government. And they often have an independent board of directors, and they're probably selling goods or services for a profit, just like a private company would. However, they are set up and sponsored by the United States government. Well, why in the world would the government be in the business of setting up businesses? Well, these government corporations are often created to fill roles in the economy that Congress thinks that for whatever reason the private sector couldn't handle on its own. And so it will step in and try to fill that breach. As an example, the U.S. Postal Service can be considered a government corporation. And certainly we have private companies like UPS and FedEx, which deliver packages, but probably no private company out there is going to be willing to set up a post office in every little podunk town in the United States and deliver letters for under $1. And so if we didn't have the U.S. Postal Service, that service just wouldn't exist. Because nobody's going to be able to pull that off profitably. And so the U.S. Postal Service actually can't either. They keep raising their prices all the time, but they do fill this role that no private company probably would be able to do. And so, UPS isn't going to show up at your house 6 days a week, to deliver mail to you, probably, at least not for a reasonable price. And so Congress created the U.S. Postal Service to fill that role. And so it does a lot like a private company would, provides these shipping services and such, but it's owned by the government. Another example of a government corporation is Amtrak. And this is the United States' only passenger train service. If you want to ride on a train and get from one city to another in the United States, that's going to be an Amtrak train. And that's a government corporation. And as it turns out, in the modern world, in the United States at least, private companies just can't seem to make a profit running a passenger train service. And by the way, neither can Amtrak. It hemorrhages money like crazy. But Congress is determined, and then it's wisdom, that we need passenger trains. And so that wasn't going to happen unless the government got involved, because no one else can make money at it. And so Amtrak was set up to run a passenger rail service. And if you want to ride Amtrak, you have to buy a ticket, just like you would to go on an airplane. But as a government corporation, Amtrak regularly can come before Congress begging for more taxpayer money because usually its operations are losing money. But Congress has decided that we need to keep it in business to provide this important service that no private company is going to provide. And so it is controversial because, we keep pouring money into it and it keeps losing money. And some people question whether we need it at all. But Congress, for the moment at least, has decided that we do. So it set up this agency, essentially, to run a passenger train service and charge money for tickets and get people from one city to another. So government has gotten into business this way with this government corporation. Government corporations can be pretty controversial. Let's consider the example of Amtrak here. If you ran a private airline, for instance, let's say you're flying between New York and Washington, D.C., well, there's an Amtrak line that goes between New York and Washington. So you have this train as your competition for hauling people between these two cities. Well, your competitor, which is Amtrak, can keep losing money hand over fist and yet stay in business because it's getting tax money from Congress that you and other Americans are paying into Washington. So as a private airline, are you going to be happy about that? Because essentially your own government is in competition with you in running your business. And so situations like this can actually be pretty controversial, where it looks like government is competing with private enterprise. And that often prompts calls for the government to sell off government corporations to private investors. And that's a process we call privatization. And that has happened sometimes in the past, where the government will just decide, we really don't need this government corporation anymore, we'll just sell it. And so they will sell it, to private investors who will actually just take it and turn it into a private company. And so some people are really in favor of that, and that's a popular doctrine among conservatives who question the whole premise of whether the government has any business being in business in the first place. There's a private economic sector that's supposed to be in business, and so why is our own government competing with that? And so they would question the whole premise of that. More liberal folks would argue that these government corporations fill a role in the economy that can't be adequately handled by private enterprise, and so the government has a legitimate role there. And so there is a healthy debate about the role of government corporations and what they ought to be doing. Well, you need to make the point that the federal bureaucracy is constantly changing. Anytime Congress passes a law creating some new program, a lot of times it'll create a brand new agency to administer the program or give additional powers to an old agency. And so the powers and reach of the federal bureaucracy are changing all the time. And sometimes we will have old agencies merge together to create a new one as the times and needs of the country change. A pretty old example of that is right after the Constitution came into effect, Congress created a Department of the Navy and a War Department. Those things were seen as separate. We needed one to run the Army and the other to run the Navy. Well, decades later, they were both merged into one department, which is now known as the Department of Defense. And that makes sense. We want a more coordinated national defense policy. We can't have the Army doing one thing, the Navy doing something else, not talking to each other, so we wouldn't want that. And the Air Force, of course, was later added to the Department of Defense as well. And so these agencies have evolved over time and combined, in this case, to make, to handle the needs of the current day in a way that they couldn't if we had left them alone. Sometimes our changing national priorities make it necessary to alter the bureaucracy in some way. For instance, after 9/11, the biggest threat facing the country appeared to be terrorist acts on American soil. And so the federal bureaucracy was really caught flat-footed by that idea. And so to respond to that, a whole new department was created called the Department of Homeland Security. And into that department, a lot of different agencies were shifted in order to create a more coherent response to the internal threats within the country. And one of the problems after 9/11 that was seen is these different agencies weren't talking to each other. The CIA knew things that it wasn't telling the FBI, and the FBI knew things it wasn't telling the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and all this kind of stuff. They just weren't talking to each other. And so a lot of these different agencies their relationships were shifted around, and Homeland Security was created as a department to handle all of this. And so the Federal Emergency Management Agency was an independent agency, and it got shifted into Homeland Security. The INS ended up being moved from the Justice Department to Homeland Security. The Secret Service was taken away from the Treasury Department and moved into Homeland Security. And so in this way, the structure of the federal bureaucracy was shifted around to meet these new needs that we're seeing. And so the structure of all these agencies and their powers can and do change all the time. Now we're going to talk about the process of actually hiring agency employees. And we talked about some of this earlier when we were discussing the president and his job. And we already talked about the top jobs and many of those that are kind of second tier as well, who are in charge of managing these federal agencies, are usually filled when the president nominates someone who is confirmed by the Senate. And we looked at that process earlier. And these folks are usually from the same party as the president. They share his ideals and agree with his ideas, and they're expected to push the president's agenda and make his policy goals a reality. And so for that reason, we don't expect them to disagree with the president publicly. They're supposed to be on the same team and trying to get the same kind of thing done. So loyalty to the president is an important factor to consider when the president is looking for people to fill these top jobs in these agencies. And of course, loyalty itself is not enough. Hopefully they know something about what they're doing. If we nominate someone to run the Treasury Department, we hope they know something about economics, for instance. Or if they're running the EPA, they ought to know something about environmental science. And so we want them to have some familiarity with the subject matter, but it's okay to also see if they're on the same page as the president politically, if they agree with his goals, because he's going to depend on them to carry out his goals for the country. So, as an example, someone who is nominated to head the Treasury Department, that has a huge role in determining American economic policy. We're going to expect them to have some kind of background in economics or business. A lot of times, former company CEOs are chosen for this job, but it might be an economist, someone who's really smart about finance could go in there. But we want someone with some kind of expertise in that area to be hired. Presidents also like to use these appointments to promote diversity, a fairly recent development, but President George W. Bush ended up nominating the first African-American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, also the first black woman to hold that same post, Condoleezza Rice, nominated the first Hispanic Attorney General, Roberto Gonzalez, and so sometimes presidents will kind of make a point to choose a diverse group of folks to head these agencies, and those are laudable goals to make sure that we don't overlook minority folks who are very well qualified for these posts. And sometimes presidents will use these appointments to further the cause of diversity. Well, even if Congress is not controlled by the president's political party, usually the Senate will still confirm whoever the president wants, so long as they are qualified, so long as they clearly know something about the field that we're putting them into. We will not normally reject them because of political ideology. Sometimes that does happen, but not normally. And the reason for that is mainly practical, because even if the other parties in control of Congress, they realize someday the tables are going to be turned, and they'll have a president from their own party in office, and they would want that president to have the freedom to appoint officials who support his policies. And so they will usually do that courtesy to the president who is in office, and won't spend a great deal of time griping about what these people believe, because they know they're going to be on the same page as the president politically. So even if they disagree with the president, as long as these people are pretty well qualified, they will normally be confirmed by the Senate and without a whole lot of trouble, but some exceptions to that. Well, while the high-level administrators of agencies are appointed and confirmed by the Senate, the lower-level employees are hired with a different process. And it certainly wouldn't make sense if we had the president nominating people to be janitors and they had to be confirmed by the Senate. That just doesn't make any sense at all. And so we have a completely different system for dealing with the low-level employees and how they are hired and promoted within the system. And we're going to look at that next. These lower-level employees of agencies are hired through what we call the civil service system. The idea of this system is that we need to hire the people who are best qualified for the job, and they should be promoted because they do a good job, not because of who their friends are, what their political beliefs are, or their powerful friends, that kind of thing. We want them to be hired and promoted because they're the best person for the job and they're doing a good job. So people wanting government jobs have to take what's called the civil service exam, which is a test that determines what jobs they're qualified to hold. Once they are hired and they're promoted based on their job performance. They often make a career out of government service. They're there for many, many years. It doesn't matter who the president appoints to head these government agencies. The lower level employees will be experienced and they'll know how to run the agency well. So it doesn't really matter who the president is, what the president believes politically. He's not going to fire all these lower level employees. They're just there because they do a good job. They know what they're doing. And so this system is designed to be fair and also to advance the government by making sure we have competent people who are doing these jobs. And so these lower level employees cannot be fired just because a president from a different political party comes into office. He'll fire all the old department heads maybe and put in new people in the top jobs who believe exactly what he believes. But these people who are doing the grunt work every day, working in the offices and cranking out the paperwork and all that stuff, they're going to be left alone. They're not going to be fired just because we have a new president from a different party. Well, that's the system we have today. Prior to the civil service system, government jobs were handed out on what we called the spoils system or the patronage system. And that went up until the later 1800s. And up until it was changed, even the low-level government jobs were often handed out to political friends of the president. And so the idea was if you help the president on his election campaign, for instance, help him get elected into office, well, as a payback for that, you were expecting to get some kind of cushy government job as your reward for that service to the president. And so he would appoint you into one of these government jobs, so you'd have a nice income working for the government. Well, this led to lots of problems. For one thing, they hired people who were often incompetent because they weren't chosen because of their abilities, just chosen by how good they were able to suck up to the president and whatever services they had done for him, getting him elected. And so that was bad. Also, there was a high turnover. The next president elected would probably fire all the people from the last president and put his friends in those jobs, hire all new people. Well, they wouldn't know how the government was supposed to run. And so we'd have all these new people there who are trying to figure out how to make the government work. And maybe no one was left over from the last regime. And so that led to all kinds of inefficiency. So we had incompetent people. Then we had people, so much turnover, no one knew how to do their job. And then we had, of course, federal benefits and government contracts and things being handed out by these various agencies, often being steered to people who belong to one political party rather than being distributed fairly to everyone. It just led to all kinds of potential for corruption because these people were all political hacks, basically. They were hired because of their political leanings, and so they would have a tendency to help out the people that they were friends with, and it was just all very much I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of a thing. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of incompetent people working for the government, just not a good situation. People finally got a gutful of all of that in 1881 when President Garfield was assassinated. And the person that killed him claimed that he was angry because after President Garfield was elected into office, he had helped with the campaign, but he was not given one of these cushy government jobs that he was expecting. And so he was really upset about that and decided to go shoot President Garfield. Well, that was shocking to the public, and they said, it's time to clean this up. And so they ended up creating the civil service system, which was designed to hire and promote people based on their actual abilities. So what we see happening with these agencies, the top jobs are still appointed. The people in those jobs are chosen because they're political allies of the president. They share his goals and his dreams and aspirations and all of that. But then these lower jobs in the agencies are given to competent civil servants. They make a career out of knowing how to run a government agency. So we hire them because they're smart. We promote them because they do a good job, and they're supposed to keep the government humming along no matter who the political people are who are calling the shots. And so whatever the goals are, they're supposed to make it happen. And so we have a system that's not perfect, but it usually works. And so we have the ability of the president to get, people that are on the same page with him running these agencies. But the lower level people who, keep the lights on and make sure the bills are paid and the mail gets mailed and the floors get swept and all that stuff, they're hired through a pretty fair system and promoted normally because they do a good job. And so this kind of mixes the two. Again, it's not perfect, but it seems to work pretty well. Let's talk a little now about oversight of these different agencies, because as we've seen, they have a lot of power. They have the power to make rules, enforce the rules. They even have judicial functions. So do we just let them run amok, or do we, kind of keep the reins on them to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do? Who is keeping an eye on them to make sure they don't overstep their bounds, they don't go beyond their authority? Well, as it turns out, all three branches of government have roles in agency oversight and making sure that these agencies don't go off the reservation and do something that they shouldn't do. The president and the executive branch have oversight in a couple of ways. The president sets the direction for government policy and thus guides the agencies in a particular direction. Remember, he normally, in most cases, gets the power to hire and fire the people in charge of these agencies. And so, since he's the one who hires the Secretary of Agriculture, if he doesn't like what that department's doing, he can call in the Secretary of Agriculture and say, hey, what are you doing? Do something else or do something differently, or I'll find a new Secretary of Agriculture. So he has the power to kind of order them around a little bit. And that's not true of in the Independent Regulatory Commission so much, but even there he gets the power to nominate people to run the agency. And so the executive branch gets a role in overseeing most of these agencies, which actually belong to the executive branch, and kind of setting the overall direction, setting the policy goals that the president wants them to do. And so he has oversight in that way. The other two branches get in on the act as well, including Congress. Remember that Congress sets up these agencies in the first place by writing the statutes that creates them. And it has the power to change the structure of the bureaucracy in any way that it wants to. It has the power to set the boundaries for what they can do and what they can't do. It can order the agencies to do certain things. It can tell them, EPA, this is what we want you to do through legislation, and the EPA has to obey that. And so the Congress, can create, can destroy, can merge these agencies, it can tell them what their priorities are and do all kinds of things. And so it has a huge amount of power over the agencies. And if the agencies end up passing rules Congress doesn't like, we already mentioned, Congress can just write legislation that changes those rules and override them. And so Congress has a tremendous amount of power. The courts also get in on the act as well. These rules that agencies create are reviewable by the courts and the judicial branch. And so what happens is people who are adversely affected by some agency rule can sue the agency in federal court. And they will usually claim that the rule violates either the Constitution itself or some other federal law, some statute passed by Congress. And remember, those statutes will trump whatever the agency does. And so people who are unhappy with these rules that the agency comes up with can sue them, end up in federal court and have a federal judge rule on whether the agency overstepped its bounds or not. And so the courts keep an eye on what the agencies do too. And so we have all three of these branches of government keeping an eye on what the so-called fourth branch of government is doing. And so that's how we keep tabs on them and make sure that they don't overstep their boundaries, because they do have a lot of power. And so we need to kind of rein them in sometimes and make sure that they're not doing things they're not supposed to be doing. Well, most people aren't all that fond of bureaucracy. That has even the word itself has a bad connotation. You hear bureaucracy and you think of red tape and inefficiency and all kinds of horrible thoughts. And if you've ever stood in line a long time getting your driver's license renewed, for instance, you know that bureaucracies often aren't very quick or efficient. Sometimes they don't have the best customer service, and sometimes they do boneheaded things. And so they get a pretty bad reputation sometimes. But our federal government probably could not function without agencies doing the work of implementing government policy. Congress can have all the wonderful big ideas that it wants to, and so can the president, but unless there's someone with boots on the ground to put those into practice, nothing's ever going to happen. And so everyone realizes that bureaucracies are necessary. These federal agencies, we have to have them in order to carry out the work of the federal government. There is, though, a healthy debate on how large the federal government really needs to be, and we will hear about this in election years quite frequently. Liberals are more often eager to expand the power of the government. They see the government as a tool to redress wrongs in society, to be able to make the world a better place. And so they like to create new social programs, regulate things to make sure people aren't messing up the environment or, cheating other people and that sort of thing. And as a result, a lot of times agencies are necessary to administer these programs, either giving new powers to old agencies or creating brand new agencies. And so liberals often tend to expand the power of government into new areas and getting it to regulate new things or issue new benefits to people or whatever the case might be. On the other hand, conservatives are usually striving to limit the size of government and the power and extent of government agencies, and so they would like to rein it in. And so we have this continual debate, and it really just depends on who's in charge, on which view gets to be preeminent there. And it does change over time. After President Reagan was elected in 1980, there was a trend for a while toward devolving federal power to the states, and so taking federal power away, giving it back to the states, and also reducing or eliminating government agencies. And so President Reagan was a conservative, and he liked to clean house a little bit and was trying to shrink the federal government a little bit. But that didn't last forever. In recent years, the trend has reversed itself. The federal government seems to be growing, reaching into more and more aspects of private industry and American life. regulating more things all the time. And so that is a kind of a trend that the bureaucracy tends to kind of grow over time. But the political winds could change again, and this trend might change as well. And some new president might come in and try to reduce the power of the government. So what is certain is that the federal bureaucracy is going to continue to change and evolve as needed to meet our challenges, whatever they happen to be, and to implement government policy, whatever that happens to be at a particular time. So that's bureaucracies for you. Not all that exciting and thrilling, but these agencies are critically important to making sure the government can actually do what we need it to do, because Congress and the president, they can set the goals, but someone has to actually carry those out, and that's usually somebody working in a government agency. So there you have it, and that's it for this week of American Government, and I will see you later.